Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lisa Grace. I'd love to just take a moment to introduce Morgan to you. I don't know if she needs much introduction, but Morgan is an educator who is quite an experienced educator, and she's written a book which explores the topic that she's going to be talking about today. Her book is The Enrichment Shift, and it's coming out in this year. I think it's coming out, Morgan will tell us more, but I think it's coming out in another month or so, and it's from John Catt. And she tackles enrichment, equity, and challenge for all by reinventing traditional conceptions of gifted and talented programs. She's a dynamic senior leader who is currently the Director of Teaching and Learning for about another few weeks in Abu Dhabi, but she's worked most of her career in British curriculum schools and has taken on such roles as head of sixth form, head of humanities, head of scholars, and she's from Canada. She currently holds an NQPSL degrees from Queen's University and the University of Gulf. I think that's how you pronounce that, where she was a President's Scholar. Thank you so much for joining this Teach Middle East live webinar. Morgan, over to you.
Thank you so much. I am so impressed by the diversity that we have in the audience. I'm from Canada. I teach at an international school, and it's really a treat to be able to reach so many people and discuss a topic that I absolutely love. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to share my screen, and I'll just bring it up. What I'm going to be discussing today is looking at challenge for all. And let's see, I'll just share my screen now, and I'll pull that up so you hopefully will be able to see a really great picture of an elephant. My new book that is coming out, it is called Gifted, The Shift to Enrichment, Challenge, and Equity. And so the ideas that I explore today really get to the core of what challenge is. And hopefully you'll be able to see that there. Perfect. Okay, so challenge for all, making students have progress in every single moment of their day and every single lesson. It sounds like that should be easy, that that's a part of our everyday planning, that they're engaged every single minute of school. But having students engaged and having students make their way towards that progress by challenging them is not as simple as we might believe. And for the simple reason of this, that challenge is productive struggle. It means that we're asking our students to think hard. And challenge is more than just new content. It is being stretched to understand the world beyond your immediate experience. It is equipping students with the intellectual tools to respond to complexity and to solve problems. I love this graphic that's from Sean Ellison and Andy Tharby's wonderful book, Making Every Lesson Count, because it's all about how we scaffold effectively. All students need to climb over the top of that wall that we set for them. We don't pull them up with ropes, but we provide lots of different types of ladders for students to reach their goals. So how do we challenge them effectively? I'd like to begin with a few stories. This is Luca, and Luca loves geography. He requests a seat at the very front of my class on our very first geography lesson. His back is ramrod straight as he sits poised to shoot up his hand at the very first opportunity. I test him on destructive plate boundaries. He boasts that he understands all plate tectonics because he learned about it over the summer. He eagerly shares that he's read every article National Geographic has ever published. Luca confides that his dream is to visit Iceland. He wants to work in sustainable energy and has done research on the lava fields. He begs for me to quiz him. And he stayed after that class. He's taken up most of break time talking. And I came out of that interaction amused and smiling. I made a few mental notes about his favorite topics, and then I promptly looked up his past test scores and exam results. And our internal reports showed that he was an average B student. His effort grades across the board were mixed. He was enthusiastic, but off task. And his cognitive ability score was way below average. Would he be identified as a gifted student? No. Would he be identified as high ability? No. Would he be identified as more able? No. But would he benefit from further extension in my class? Yes. This was a student that is crying out for more challenge. And a student can be crying out for extension, but data analysis and the structures of a school often overlook them. He won't appear to be underachieving by tests that measure his potential. He is meeting age-related expectations, yet at the same time, he is being underserved. Students may be unintentionally hidden, and we need to find them. So my next example is Grace. This is Grace, and Grace is sitting on table 4 in my classroom. I was recently discussing with a friend how I was taught to plan my lessons in my very first year of teaching in the UK. At the beginning of the year, I would look at my list of students and their baseline testing. I would look at their media score, their cognitive tests that they did at the beginning of the year. And based on those scores, I neatly organized my students into ability groups. And my seating chart and my planning looked something like this. I would divide and stratify my students into different tables. And for each lesson, I would have 3 different learning objectives. All students can, most students can, some students can. And I would assign different tasks to each group. I would also do separate accommodations for my EAL and my SEN students. And for Grace, who was sitting in my low ability group, I did not expect her to do the same level of work or be capable of the same certain high level skills. In my planning itself, I had put a cap on her learning. And more than that, Grace knew that I had put a cap on her learning. She knew that she was on the low ability tasks and that her tasks were simple, that her table was not expected to do as much. Kids are perceptive. And so she internalized that and she expected less of herself. Now, this is Abdullah. And this isn't a story of what happened to me, but this is one of my colleagues, Stephen, who shared this example to me years ago, and it always stuck with me. When he was a new teacher being observed, he planned a multiplication lesson for his year 2 students, where they were drawing dot diagrams in rows and columns. So they had to do dots of 3 and dots of 4, and then they would get those 12 dots equaling 12. Abdullah was an exceptionally bright child, an exuberant boy, and Stephen had built challenge in his lesson, knowing that that was something the observer would be looking for and that he needed to be prepared for in this class. So Abdullah proudly ran off to Stephen after just a few minutes and showed off his page with 3 columns and 4 rows equaling 12 dots. Wonderful. And then Stephen said, the challenge question is on the board. Can you do 6 times 7? And Abdullah ran off. And Stephen busied himself looking around the room, helping other students, and Abdullah turned ridiculously quickly later with a page of 42 dots. Now, Stephen was now wary that the observer's eyes were on him, and he decided he really needed to pitch high. So he decided he was just going to really have to challenge Abdullah. And he said, wow, Abdullah, can you draw 12 times 18? And immediately Abdullah looked at him exasperated. You want me to draw 216 dots, sir? And Stephen glanced around the room, saw 3 other students that needed his attention, and hurriedly replied to Abdullah, yes, that would be impressive. And he left Abdullah to draw 216 dots. Stephen later said that that's when he truly understood challenge. It is not more of the same skill or an additional challenge question that's added to every task in a lesson. True challenge must have an element of novelty and exploration. The mantra should be not more, but interesting. He simply needed a strategy that was larger than this small add-on, slightly more challenging task. Now, putting this all together, we can see that Abdullah, he's busy, but not challenged. And when we look at the lessons learned from these 3 students, a student can be crying out for extension, but we miss it. Differentiation and ability thinking can actually put a cap on learning and progress. And extension can exist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's challenging a student. And what's really great about education right now is that we are moving away from these conceptions. And a lot of my background and work has to do with giftedness. In fact, that's why the name of my book is Gifted, with a huge emphasis on the question mark after that word. I like to deal in dismantling the idea of giftedness, which may be strange because many of us think that gifted and talented is actually passe, that it's an elitist and an antiquated term. I was talking to a colleague recently and she said, gifted and talented, seriously, is that still a thing? And that's the misconception. Giftedness and talentedness, that's a zombie. It's dead, but it's still walking around. There are new labels that we use to stratify students. More able is really popular. High ability, high aptitude is one that I'm seeing a lot of now. But new labels do not equal new thinking. And the concept of ability is really stubbornly embedded in our educational structures. And I find giftedness the perfect entry point for how we challenge our conceptions of ability. Giftedness should be a thing of the past, discarded and dismantled, but it simply isn't. In fact, you could say that it's a rose by any other name. The original purpose of Gifted and Talented was to make sure that we challenge students who would otherwise go under challenged. And in fact, there have been panics, both in the US, in the UK, and Australia, and Canada, that our most able pupils in schools aren't being stretched the way they should be. Sir Michael Wilshaw in the UK laminated this in a massive 2013 report. We can see it as a constant refrain in inspections. I was having a chat with some teaching and learning friends from different schools, and we all noted that challenge for all and stretching the students who are most able was one of our school priorities across about 12 schools. So it is a worthy endeavor to challenge high attaining students. We have old fashioned frameworks to do so, though. The legacy of giftedness tends to conceive what we think of in challenge. We need to change more than the name. We need to change our thinking. And I'd recommend that we do this in three ways. I'd like us to look at how we can enrich our mindset. We don't teach high achieving pupils, we are teaching high achieving behaviors. I'd like to look at our provision, so everything that happens outside of our classrooms that can really help enrich students. And I'd like to look at our pedagogy that should be, above all else, challenge first. And again, challenge is hard. Most of the time, we do see it as an additive extension. And when I was a new teacher, I was constantly kind of told that add one extra chance, a task, that extension activity that can make a student busy. And a student can be busy. They can be busy with an extra worksheet. We can tell them to read ahead, to do another past paper, to pursue independent reading. But then we have to ask these questions about the challenge that we're giving them. Does that challenge have a ceiling? Is it hard enough or ambitious enough? Does it encourage intellectual curiosity? Are we overwhelming students by giving them a myriad of tasks? Are students intrinsically motivated or independent enough to do the work? Are we actually engaging them in exciting material and bigger questions? Are we just sending them to do something slightly ahead of what the class would cover later on? Is the task interesting? And there can be implied expectations in how we deliver extension. A common technique is to create extension menus where students choose a task that runs from mild to spicy to red hot chili in its difficulty. Now we have to ask, does this raise the bar for all students? Because there definitely may be an incentive to choose the less demanding skill. Is extra work a type of performance punishment? The standard expected of each task can be really open to interpretation. And while the task menu can provide students with choices in product or content, it doesn't necessarily provide complexity or change their motivation. So the rule of thumb really should be not more work, but more exciting. And that's why I'd say that we have to look at our pedagogy and really think about how we can make it challenge first. And by challenge first, I kind of go back to this. This challenge first moment hit me when I was doing a learning walk in our lower primary school. The pedagogy is one of learning through play, through continuous provision. And in every room, there was an environment of exploration with different stations. Children moved from area to area, these different stations, looking at a collection of resources. And the purpose of continuous provision is to encourage students to become active learners who are creatively interacting with their learning materials. And each station had a set of research sheets, cards, exemplars, keywords, scaffolded tasks, and prompts for them to use, as well as a challenge task that required all of these skills. So looking at these stations set up, I asked our head of primary, how many students actually complete the challenge element? And she looked at me with a smile and she said, oh, they all do the challenge first. You can't hold them back. That's the fun part. They figure out everything else. They look at everything else in on the table in order to succeed in that challenge. And that was the key. The experience for the students was about meeting that one high learning goal. It was challenge first. They would jump to the most difficult and complicated assignment, and they used the resources that were there to meet and go beyond any assumed expectations. And that overarching challenge is really, really key because there are so many exciting directions we can take. There's lots of opportunity for challenge. And a lot of the times we think, well, how do we create those opportunities? How do we do that within the confines of one lesson when I have so much to cover? And I think when you think big, you have to think big over a longer period of time as well. One of the routes that you can take is to choose project-based learning. So this is something that I've used in 3 of the schools that I've taught at in the past. So whether EPQ or personal projects for IB, a deep conceptual understanding can be brought in our curriculum and create opportunities for depth, having one high-end goal visible and accessible for all students. So in our secondary school right now, what we've done is every single department has developed an extension project that students can access at any time. They're posted on the doorway of every single classroom that a student can then tackle a really great challenge. It's open-ended. It can be research-based. It can be inquiry-based. It can be problem-based where you're given a real-world problem and have to find a real-world application. And you can use design-based thinking, but the idea is as open-ended as it is, and it kind of gives a starting place for students, they have the ability to drive the direction, and there's an element of student choice. Also, this is exploration that is outside the curriculum diet that you would be giving them every single day. And it's really great at the end when they have finished up with these enrichment projects to give them the opportunity to show off. One of the things I highly recommend is that all students who finish an enrichment project, they present it to the class, or better yet, have a symposium, invite experts from outside the school and community to come and judge and give commentary on these projects. It should be an opportunity for them to showcase kind of a deeper exploration of their own choosing, using what the school has provided for them as a jumping off point. Another way that you can enrich the pedagogy and bring a higher level of challenge is to have things like student-led learning. I highly recommend things like Harkness, oracy, and debate-centered argumentation. So when we look at learning through talk, it really is a way for students to truly articulate and synthesize, as opposed to simply regurgitating from a textbook. I think that there's a lot of emphasis on exams, and you want to be able to give students skills beyond exam talk and working with a certain specification so that they can engage in the material in an authentic way. And I was at a conference last week where we were actually discussing the age of AI and ChatGPT, and that students were growing up in a world where they didn't need to write essays. There were academic integrity concerns and how we could actually engage students in thinking critically. And when you have something like Harkness or oracy, they have to think on their feet. They have to engage with others' ideas and respond in the moment. Discussion and verbally working through problems collaboratively really hits those 21st century skills. And that's how they can learn. You can put them on the stage. If you haven't seen Harkness before, it's really a fantastic method. Instead of the traditional model of a teacher delivering information to students, giving them a task, they do the task, you take up the task, there's kind of a routine involved in that. Instead, you put students at the center. You give them a kind of non-hierarchical structure of an oval table where no one sits at the head, and the students are expected to take up the topic and engage with it. It really is student-led and really promotes inquiry. They really have to promote speaking to each other and then debrief and say, well, what did I learn through the process of simply communicating this way? The other thing that I'd say about these skills is that you can't really dive into the deep end with them. All of these skills, whether it's oracy, debate, or Harkness conference method, it really must be scaffolded. I've actually made the mistake of introducing Harkness in a sixth form. Harkness has become huge in sixth form, but you can't just let students dive in. You'll get weird pauses. Students will get lost as to where they are supposed to step in because they might not have created that community of safe space. They don't know the discussion expectations. They might not be very good at any extemporaneous speaking. They haven't done debate where they've really had to interrogate the pros or cons of an argument. So scaffolding these skills over time and building them into your key stage 3, key stage 4 curriculum can really make a huge, huge difference in helping them truly find their voice and then giving them a platform that is really powerful. The next thing that I'd suggest every single day that you can add in your lessons are Kaplan icons for depth and complexity. These icons can be put just alongside of your whiteboards, and then you can simply point at them when you want students to think about one of these things, where they could add detail or where they could look for language of the discipline. What are the keywords there that allow them to use that disciplinary language? What are the rules that actually are created within this topic that have to be followed? The ethical ramifications of a topic, how could they look and evaluate those? How can you look at things cross disciplinaries? So if we were taking like a cross curricular links, what can you find there? So Kaplan icons can also be put on worksheets. You can stick them as stickers into students' books so they have to interact with that as feedback, but extremely, extremely useful when we look at changing our pedagogy to have overarching challenge. The next thing I'd add is that we want to make sure that we have a degree of difficulty in our curriculum because it is so easy to underestimate students. I have a friend who works as an English teacher who repeatedly tells me that the hardest text can be the best text to interrogate. Last year, I attended a school play where the year 5 and 6 students tackled Shakespeare's Midsummer's Night Dream, one of my favorite plays, with aplomb. They adroitly handled the intricacy of the plot. They were voracious in their use of sophisticated vocabulary. Students moved the setting from Athens to our own school, and you could see that they had actually done that, explaining and making connections to our staff and their peers, playing and teasing out the themes. And there was a trust with the teachers that students could thrive under this source materials. It made the case that we don't need to pander or simplify or be linear in our approach. And this is how I view teaching to the top, that we have high expectations for every student. And this means inviting all students to engage in Think Hard material. And I think we've all had experiences where I'm sure we've also had lessons where students question beard into advanced territory. You can all of a sudden find yourself teaching a topic from your university course to 13-year-olds. And this can be described as scaling up. You can fill your year 7 curriculum with year 10 content and skills, exposing students to knowledge outside their age and level. And we can also scale out, going beyond a state prescribed curriculum to topics that will enrich their understanding, construct cross curricular connections, and real world applications. And we can see that that's really, really key when we look at how we can add richness to our curriculum. One of the key ways that we can do that and be culturally responsive is by looking at how we can diversify and decolonize our curriculum. So texts written by and about marginalized communities should really be placed at the center. We want to make sure that students feel represented and that they grow their understanding of the world. Abstraction is a fantastic place to start. So you can actually begin a new topic with a high level overview so that students can explore the more detailed layers, interest later. So allows them to kind of see, okay, this is what we're going to be looking at as a whole. But then we can see the patterns, make connections, and consider the broader implications as we grow our understanding. One useful way to do that is with graphic organizers, which can help us take really complex information and then you ask students with visual aids to kind of put it in a format that's understandable. Technical and specific use of disciplinary language, as I've mentioned, is quite powerful. Students use that as a tool, and it's pretty integral to powerful knowledge. We can take a look at interleaving, interdisciplinary studies, depth studies, and really flexible curriculum pathways so that we do not kind of keep students on a curriculum pathway that narrows their opportunity. Now, this kind of brings me to our next component, which is enriching our mindset. So again, we don't teach high achieving pupils, we're trying to teach high achieving behaviors. And this is really important because we know that teacher attitude has a huge impact. One of the most cited studies about mindsets was by Rosenshall and Jacobson, who famously told a set of teachers that a group of their students had taken cognitive ability IQ tests and that there were intellectual bloomers in their groups that were gifted. And lo and behold, it was these intellectual bloomers that over the course of a year improved tremendously, not only in their internal exams, but their IQ scores actually improved as well, which was formerly thought to be very stagnant. Now, these students were randomly selected, so that truly changed. So, what really truly changed were the teachers' beliefs about those students' capacity. They pushed them harder because they believed that these students were capable. And Chang et al. Said the same thing. They looked at the study and said if teachers were led to expect enhanced performance from some children, then the children did indeed show enhancement. And it works in the other direction as well. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a study by Good and Brothy, which found that teachers treat low ability pupils differently. They tended to give up on these pupils and they tended to have low expectations for them. They criticized them more often for failure and praised them less following success. Sometimes they neglected to give feedback following their responses. They tended to seat them at the back of the room. They paid less attention and interacted with them less frequently than their other students and their high ability peers. And more than that, it was quite clear that there was less rapport and warmth and interest in these students as individuals, which is heartbreaking. But it does show that teachers' ability, our attitudes about ability, really, really matter. And this kind of we can see in our structures as well. It's a fact that's really hard to swallow, considering that we do structure our schools and our curriculum pathways around ability all the time. In this one graph, we can see countries and how they group pupils by ability into different classes or sets. And then we can also see how many students are then grouped by ability within those stratified classes. And just for reference, when we look at that graph on the right-hand side, at the very top, there's a red little dot right there that I've kind of highlighted, and that's the UK, that's England. So it really is a staple of the US and the UK curriculum where students are tracked. So that's a really scary fact. And what makes it scarier is the fact that we know that overall, setting by ability really doesn't work. Study after study after study, whether from Canada, Australia, the US, the UK, has found that setting or tracking does not work for the majority of students. In fact, it works the opposite. It tends to bring overall outcomes down. The Education Endowment Fund has done meta-analysis and highly disagrees with the practice. It has a particularly detrimental effect on marginalized groups, on summer-born children, and actually supports social immobility, as students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend not to be put in top sets. And we can see this in studies like Bowler, William, and Brown, that students do not thrive under setting. While high-attaining students might make marginal gains overall, students altogether make less progress. When we take a look at the specifics, you can see that when we had girls on the highest ability sets, they thought that they weren't able and didn't deserve to be there. Students from all age groups were disaffected by the limits that were placed on their attainment. Students gave up when they discovered that their teachers had simply been preparing them to pass with the lowest grade. And as much as we may try to think that a socioeconomic class has nothing to do with setting, studies found that it did, that they were put into low sets even after ability was put into account. And that really has to do that we need to pay attention to outcome and not intent. For some students, when they looked at the particular sets, they found that the pace was too slow, resulting in disaffection. If it was too fast, it resulted in anxiety. So it wasn't a positive experience for students across the board. And that's why overall, I do worry a lot about the term ability, because it is just so common to put students stratified in set 1 to set 6, that we use terms like high ability, middle ability, low ability. I think we should take into account that giftedness, which has to do with ability, giftedness was invented, not discovered. More able labels can reflect the social constructions that we have of developmental potential. And I think that we can hold two things in our hands at the same time. The first is that cognitive ability testing tells us interesting things, but that we shouldn't make what we gain from that information incredibly high stakes. And in fact, when we look at things like cognitive ability testing with GL, CAT4, is that we know that as insightful that this testing can be, the most useful thing about CAT4 is that it tells us about batteries. Each test of CAT4 looks at biases. Who has a spatial bias? Who has a verbal deficit? And this informs me as a teacher how I can change my instruction. The CAT4 reports that we get are actually more interesting when we look at the gaps between these different batteries, as opposed to just looking at one standardized score, which is an average of all those batteries together. This is one of the most important tools that we have in flagging neuro differences and are vital for learning support and inclusion teams. So this data isn't meant to divide and exclude students from opportunities. In fact, in my school, we have moved away from using the term ability altogether. We like to use the word attaining, as in this moment, this student is high attaining in geography, but that can change. I know that a student might be high attaining in physical geography because they love plate tectonics, but then when it looks at development, they might be lower attaining in human geography. And I want to be responsive to that change and where they are exactly in their learning through formative assessment. We want to know exactly where a student is at that exact moment. And having adaptive teaching strategies is really the key here. We need to replace ability thinking with universally high expectations. Tom Sherrington has repeatedly asserted that we should give students layers of complexity because they crave it. So teach to the top, keep the degree of difficulty. My original example, when I looked at Grace and I was looking at how I could set 3 different versions of work for every single lesson, 3 different learning objectives for every single lesson, looking for 3 different types of resources that I could paraphrase and simplify. It's tempting to do that, to remove the subtlety. But then by losing the complexity, we really do a disservice to students. We want to talk less to the whole class and listen more to individual students. When we look at Sean Allison and Andy Tharby, their advice was simple. Walk around the classroom. Don't anticipate students' needs. Ask them in the moment and give them the prompts, the nudge, the scaffolds that are appropriate to them. Don't spend all your time planning and prepping. Spend more time being present with students. They are unique individuals, so treat them as such and be responsive to what they are giving you right there in that moment. It's more effective and efficient than planning lessons within lessons within lessons. And we can know right now that there is a huge change in how we view differentiation as opposed to adaptive instructions. What I have right here on my screen is adapted from the analysis of differentiation versus adaptive teaching that was done by Huntington Research School. And you can see with adaptive instruction, one clear learning objective trumps these must, could, should learning objectives. We're moving past it. We now know that differentiation has been said that it is dead. Alan Quigley famously wrote that a few years ago. David Dido has said that differentiation is one of the dark arts of teaching. Mary Wyatt has said that differentiation anticipates in advance what children are capable of. It's closed. It can stop teachers from addressing misconceptions, and it is a lot of work. We're subjected to death by differentiation. And in fact, we've moved past it in a lot of frameworks. Instead of my early days teaching where I was doing all those many lessons, I found it much easier to have that one learning objective with universally high expectations instead of preparing all of those different versions. Allowing students to struggle, answering questions, and adapting in the moment is powerful. Use a formative assessment to check for understanding and pivoting the lesson in that moment to address the misconception. That is responsive teaching. And a lot of this has to do with having great scaffolding strategies. We should have questions at the very beginning of the class to see where the class is and how we should move forward. We should have mixed groups and high expectations of each group. It's really useful to change the compositions of table groups or where students are sitting regularly so that they get the message that there's no entrenched setting based on any type of ability. And it's important to scaffold up as opposed to scaffold down, because I know it's easy to scaffold down to make some of our resources or tasks simpler and easier. Here's the worksheet, fill in the blanks, match these things. This work, more than anything else, tends to be remedial. We're asking students to catch up on something that they haven't done before, or it wasn't quite there because there's unfinished learning from the previous lesson. Scaffolding up is different. It puts the cognitive burden on students to interact with their learning, modeling, peer coaching, think alouds, questions that focus on larger concepts or key principles. Students need to practice the declarative knowledge and the procedural process in metacognition, knowing what tactics to use when they're solving a problem. And here's a really key example. So on the left, I've put some scaffolding strategies. On the right, this is really exciting. This is actually principles of adaptive teaching that I found on the back of a staff ID card in Newland School in Dubai. When I recently visited there, they have placed adaptive instruction as the cornerstone of their teaching and learning policy. Their ethos and pedagogical approach to adaptive teaching was designed as an equitable form of education where all students could achieve the highest outcomes through bespoke learning strategies. And like I said, this guide was on the back of every single staff ID badge. So their philosophy and strategy was outlined and with them all the time. And those were a higher order lesson objective, ascending steps to success, which just means there's clear 1, 2, 3 steps, scaffolds for learning. And you want to make sure that you are always adapting the support that you give the student. You're not adapting the task by giving some students a simpler task. You want to make sure that critical thinking is emphasized, that it has to be those hard think questions throughout the lesson. You want your adaptive teaching to be data driven, really dynamic, and it should have live scaffolding where you are prompting students in the moment. There should be a high volume of open-ended questions, allowing students to give you feedback and that you can check for understanding frequently. You want to give opportunities for them to assess their own work and their peers' work. And in the end, you always want to give them some dedicated improvement and reflection time, and entire lessons can be done doing just that. When we talk about getting that data in our reflective and adaptive teaching, here is the way to do it. Now, I realize that mixed ability grouping is not easy. There can be wide attainment gaps in a classroom. I have seen many math lessons go awry because 1 or 2 students completely haven't grasped the past 2, 3, 4 lessons of learning, and a teacher's time is monopolized trying to get them up to speed. So, what do you do when you have a student who does not have prior knowledge or foundational understanding to engage in the lesson that you've set? One of my dear friends who was a head of secondary challenged me when he asked, well, how do you stop this? What do you do with a student who hasn't built up the schema of knowledge, of rich knowledge to engage with the learning? And what's really exciting is that we have entered an age of AI software in education. We are seeing the entire emergence of real-time feedback that is gamified, where there's personalized learning platforms that revolutionize how we teach. Students can then access a rich knowledge deep curriculum. And that's because they can do testing where they go up and answer a question. They do well, they answer the next slightly harder question. They don't get that right, they're given the answer and told why it wasn't correct. They're answered that a similar question in a different way and they go up again. They can go up and down and have that real-time feedback and engagement right there through a platform. And that platform also gives you as a teacher a plethora, a treasure trove of knowledge. This is a massive change that allows teachers not to be replaced, but to better concentrate on the fun stuff of challenge and really help students if they need to catch up so they're not missing things. Now, one of the questions that I get asked really frequently is, okay, you said that we've had adaptive teaching. You've said that we shouldn't be looking at ability as much as we are. But what about inspections? And it's true, we all work in governments and we're all inspected by places that expect us to have a list. It's a rule. And what we want to do is we want to know our students without pigeonholing them with a label. We want to be able to identify strengths and recognize how we can bring out the best in each student to improve. And in schools I've worked with and at, what we've done in departments is we've created meaningful ways of targeting students. Now, what I want to look at first is something we've discussed. We want to look at current attainment. That is where a student is right now. I'm not so much interested in a flat, non-specific cognitive ability test that looks at overall potential based on a 90-minute test that a student took at staring at a screen once a year. I want to see how are they progressing through new content in that topic. And again, lots of formative assessment. Your own teacher mark book is pretty key. We can also look at where they are within the classroom when we look at their attainment. These could be a student that is very, very strong in leadership or collaboration skills, and that's not easily assessed by formal testing. So where are they right then and kind of leading others? The next thing that I like to look at is creative productivity. And I think that we've probably seen these students a lot. When you look at creative productivity, what I mean is that student in your English lesson that brings you a collection of poems that they've written over the summer, a computer science student that has coded a game at home in their spare time and wants you to look at it. I like to look at the characteristics and behaviors of effective learning. When you have those students that are creative and productive, that means that they are actually going out of their way to build something new. Now, they might do that because they have certain skills. So they might have skills like self-regulation, resilience, perseverance, motivation to work through obstacles, engagement, critical thinking. And these are actually skills that can be fostered. Task commitment, for instance, takes action and practice with focus and deep follow through. And all of these components are changeable. It's not a fixed way of looking at students' ability. In the center, you can see that these students might have capacity to excel, and you might have them on what might be called a targeted extension list. These are students that you're really saying, you want to be creative and productive. Why don't you take a look at the extension project in our department? You have a lot of strength in this current area. Why don't you explore that a little bit further by? When you look at characteristics of effective learning, you can see that a student might be doing very, very well, and they might be following all the rules and attaining well in a test in your class, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going beyond to be creative and create their own things. That is why you want to give opportunity for each of those things to happen. We can give students tools for self-regulation. We can make sure that we emphasize metacognition in our teaching. If you're really looking at creating a targeted extension list, then I highly recommend that it be triangulated, meaning that you're taking data from many, many different places, and that it's also subject specific. If you were simply using a CAT4 score and making those students your top students without looking at how they are acting within individual lessons in the subjects, it's not that useful. If you take a look at this kind of really great thing that we've done in departments that I've worked at in the past, we're looking at many different components to triangulate student strengths. Student A right there, that's a student that probably in the past would have been identified as gifted. Well, they have really great exam performance and high effort grades, and it looks like they're doing their homework. This is a student that knows how to navigate school. Well, student D, that might be a student that's really creative and productive. They might not do well in exams, but they really show leadership by taking on something like Model United Nations. They do good homework when they're really interested in the topic. They do great portfolios. All these things they might do, but an approach with metacognition, but they might not follow the school rules that would technically put them at the very top of our high ability lists. So now let's look lastly and briefly at provision. And this is what I would say about provision. Provision is everything that we do outside the classroom. So in many schools, this is our co-curricular program, our extracurricular program. And it's really important that we invite all, because so much learning happens outside the classroom, but there are so many barriers that stop students from being able to actually engage in that enrichment. Invitation and saying that things are open for all doesn't equal participation. We should be able to look at our tracking for these extracurriculars to see if girls are joining our STEM clubs. I found in 2 schools that I was at that they weren't. And it was only when we did a girls in STEM club that all of a sudden all these girls came out of the woodwork. Are we seeing EAL students sign up less because of language barriers? Can we see that there might be let's say, programs that are not culturally responsive to the student demographics that we have? We have to think about our structures and how they can be more inclusive, how we can take down barriers for students, because we know very much that they exist. Not all students can stay after school. Not all students are able and to financially afford to do an event like skiing or Model UN or a math leagueathon or a hackathon on the weekend. They're just simply not available to them. We also have to look at our staff constraints and what autonomy staff have to give their expertise to students. So all of these things tend to exist within schools. Some of them are within our power to change. Some of them are within our influence to change, because we do live in a kind of unfair and unequal society where not all school resources are equal. It's worthwhile saying that the small changes that we can make structurally to make sure that all students have access to enrichment are incredibly important. One of the things that we do when we have enrichment programs, so in my school right now, we do 3 huge enrichment workshops throughout the year, 1 per term, and all students are invited. So there's no invite-only clubs. There's no special gifted programs where only some students are welcome. It's not selective or exclusive. We want to make sure that everyone is there. And the example process for making sure that students have these enrichment workshops: there's nomination. Students can nominate themselves, and their teachers and parents can nominate them too, simply because some students don't have the confidence to put themselves forward. I like having that validation. So having student interviews to find out what students are interested in pursuing with their enrichment, if they're going to be doing an enrichment project, if they're going to be doing a speech, or they're going to be writing for a magazine, what are topics that they are very keen on, and what have they already done that they can show off. And then there should be celebration. Students should be invited to submit an important piece of work. Students should be able to have a letter home from parents or invited to marquee events where they can show off what they are doing. We want to make sure that we are never closing off opportunity, and that we keep everything, every single one of these opportunities, both in and out of the classroom, open to everyone. So the message to all students should be simply this: that you belong here. You belong in our classroom. You belong here, and you are deserving of challenge. You belong here, and we're making space for you. You belong here, and you're invited. And that's what is really powerful when we enrich our mindset, when we enrich our provision, and we enrich our curriculum. If you would like to learn more about these ideas, my book is coming out July 19th. Right now, it's available for pre-order on Amazon.uk. And if you'd like to order direct to the Middle East or Germany or anywhere in the world, all you need to do is you have to email export@hatchet.co.uk, and you'll be getting it in a few short weeks. If you're interested in contacting me, I'm available on LinkedIn at Morgan Whitfield. My website is challengeforall.com. I don't use Twitter much, but when I am on Twitter, you can find me at @teachmorgan. Like I said, you can just scan the barcode and that will take you directly to Amazon if you'd like. I'd like to say thank you for being here today. This is an extremely special opportunity, and I am so looking forward to your hopefully many questions. So I will stop sharing my screen then, and let's talk to Lisa Grace and see what comments she has.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you to everyone. Okay, so if you have questions for Morgan, I'd love you to pop them in the Q&A section. In the Q&A section, we will be fielding your questions. Okay, first question says, please can you share applying challenge in the foundation stage? So I think
I
this
find
person
this
wants to know more about how they do that.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. Actually, in my kind of example that I gave there, I think that foundation stage is a great example of challenge first environment. I remember talking to our deputy head of early years, and one of the things that she told me was to leave things open ended. So, in their stations, what they did is they made sure that they did always have a challenge component that was really useful. She told me one story of a year one class where they were learning about castles. And the students actually wanted to create and make their own castles. And so they began looking at all of these old photos of castles like Moat and Bailey castles. And they ended up asking for an encyclopedia, which seems so old school, an encyclopedia so they could look up, and they began building models based on that. And it was so beyond what she thought that these students would be capable of. And when I looked at the examples that she had shown me, I was amazed because they were the type of examples that I would expect of my year 7 students. So Tom Sherrington always says that we should be taking the lid off learning. So it's having those opportunities for extra exploration. So again, keeping in those stations, if you're doing continuous provision, those opportunities to see what harder, more difficult work looks like, and also for students to have a really difficult challenge that they can actually build themselves and allow themselves to be creative while you do so.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Susanna is asking, can you give an example of one of the gamified real-time AI-driven feedback platforms that you mentioned?
Yes, so there's quite a few actually. So you can use something like Education Perfect. You can use something if you're teaching in Arabic and you happen to be in the Middle East. Aleph has a lot of those. There's different language websites that have to do with vocabulary, which are very, very useful because students, I think, they need to learn that. It's very, very good. I'd say it really depends on the subject that you are teaching. And there is a lot available. I think it takes a lot of independent research to make sure that you are finding a site that is good for you. To be honest, they're everywhere right now. I think that ever since the kind of AI kickoff at the beginning of this year, I've seen about 25 million startups saying, we will plan your lesson resources, or we will have this game that students can use. And I think it's funny because you might find that students are already accessing ones that you don't know about already. I would actually talk to some ed tech gurus. One of the ones that I would really recommend is Ollie Lewis. He's fantastic. Philippa Raithwell, if you can find her on LinkedIn. Ollie is very active. Let's see, Alex Gray is another person. I would look all these people up on LinkedIn and ask them these questions because they know better than anyone how you can kind of build a really great adaptive teaching platform plan and see what's out there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Here's another question for you. We have sets for year 11 students. I remember you mentioning about ability should not be, I guess we should use attainment. Can you elaborate more on it, please? I missed that part.
Sure. So when we take a look at setting, setting overall has been found in every single context to not be successful. The rule of setting is simply this, that when you have a top set, that top set will make a marginal improvement, but overall, all outcomes will do less than if you simply had mixed ability groups. And I know that that sounds extremely hard because we do see massive gaps in prior knowledge that can hold students back, which is why it's really important that we use things like adaptive software to help these students catch up. But mixed ability groups do better overall. So if you have year 11 students who are in sets, it's really hard to break that down now because they're just approaching exams that year. But I would encourage within the classes, if you are within a school where you currently set, I would say the rule of thumb is always set less, and within those set classes, do as many mixed ability groups as possible. In Japan, they have this concept called Han, where in primary schools, they always have mixed ability groups of 4, so that the students that have the most experience or prior knowledge are always mentoring students who don't. And that can really vary from subject to subject. I think it's important to recognize too that when schools are setting, it has a knock-on effect. So I remember one year when I was teaching geography, and for some reason, a fluke of the timetable, I was given all of the science sets. So my geography students were actually in sets that were set by science. And it had a huge change in the behavior and the dynamic of these students. And it felt like they were not having this one set just within science, but it was being replicated throughout their entire educational experience, that they were with the same group of students where there were lower expectations set for them. So it's really important to look at how you can de-set a school, because the simple fact is that multi-ability groups across the school do better. And if you're going to look at not from an ethical standpoint, but from a very practical standpoint, there's a lot more value in getting a student from an E to a C in terms of value add than there is in getting an A to an A star, if you know what I mean. Obviously, you want to have enough challenge that within a class, if you're teaching really well and using the principles of adaptive teaching, that all students, regardless of their starting point, will be able to excel. So those A to A star students, you'll get them there as well.
Thank you. Rita says, how can we implement this strategy among the SEN students?
This is a great question. So SEN students, I think what's really important is that when we look at SEN students and adaptive teaching, is that if we looked at a kind of differentiation approach, a differentiation approach would look at the IEP and then you'd say, well, I assume that students would need this keyword list, or that I assume these students would need a way to break over this barrier. And what's kind of dangerous about anticipating barriers is that you're not allowing the students themselves to say what they are capable of, because they may be perfectly capable of doing that. It's more important to give them that same task and then be available for that specific prompt. Instead of giving them all the keywords, it might just be one keyword that they're actually having trouble with spelling, and it's the spelling that's stopping them, not necessarily any type of understanding. So when you look at adaptive teaching, it means that you're there for the student to prompt them, but also the whole purpose of challenge is to make sure that students have productive struggle. So you are there to make sure that they don't get to the point where there's panic in that struggle, but you are making sure that there's many opportunities for hard learning and independence and autonomy. So that's why the difference between differentiation. For certain students, it's important to know those IEPs, but it's also very important to listen to what that student is doing. That individual education plan is not a stagnant thing. It's something that exists within every single lesson. It's a plan that you respond to and adapt to in a very live way.
Thank you so much. We can take one more. I think Lynn says the Cambridge curriculum lends itself towards child-led group and collaborative learning, but I still find it difficult to include challenge that isn't just extra work. Do you know of any resources other than your book that might support me in this?
Yes, what I'd really recommend is not so much the curriculum itself, but you can change the way that you deliver that curriculum. So one of the ways that I discussed was Harkness teaching. So Harkness was something I taught the Cambridge curriculum, and I loved doing it through Harkness because there were so many ways to interpret that Cambridge curriculum and allow students to engage in it through a way that involved a lot of debate, that involved a lot of discussion. Well, I would sit back and pause and let the students fill that vacuum of silence with their own thoughts. And they would have to go backwards and forwards and really listen to each other and build upon ideas. The other thing that I'd highly recommend is that the Cambridge curriculum is like any other curriculum. It's a syllabus and it stops. So what you want to do is not so much say, well, a curriculum is something where we have a mountain and we are climbing up the mountain to reach the peak, which is taking that exam. I prefer to think of curriculum as an ocean. So we can go and travel across the ocean from one destination to the other, But within that ocean, there are so many ways that we can stop, put on some scuba gear, and like go deep instead. There's opportunities for depth studies within that curriculum where students can go off on an amazing tangent, do a deep dive, and discover so much more about a topic or about a syllabus point that they can then teach other students. I used to use something like resident expert. But yeah, tend to think of that curriculum as not a point across two places to reach or a mountain where you just hit the peak and then you stop learning, but instead as a completely undiscovered world where students can go deeper all the time.
Thank you. Brilliant. Guys, we've run out of time. People are asking for the PowerPoint. I would suggest you get in touch with Morgan. Just find her on LinkedIn. Her name is Morgan Whitfield. Very easy to find. Just send her a message, please. But I really want to thank you guys for sticking around. Please feel free to pre-order Morgan's book and also reach out to her on LinkedIn for more information, for more details. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a joy.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Bye bye.